course, whenever we have accessibility, we're looking at educational opportunities for all students, not just students with disabilities. We are from the Student Accessibility Services Office, so of course that's our primary objective, is to make sure that students with disabilities have equal access in the courses and in university experiences, but we want to make sure that everybody is being served to the greatest degree. So for example, a student who uses a screen reader could provide an audio description of an image, allowing a student with a visual disability to access information about the image. What we're talking about here is making sure that when you're using images in your course materials, you are also using descriptions of those images. And we're going to do a little, I guess, share an example of how a screen reader works in a few minutes, so you'll understand a little more of what I'm talking about. And then we know that accommodations also provide a sense of independence. And when a course is accessible, allowing students to gain the greatest benefit through being an independent learner, of course, is an objective. We also want to make sure that students are engaging in their course activities to the greatest degree. When we think about maybe students with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, we know that there may be some challenges that they face that students without those disabilities would not be facing. So these are some considerations. Linda, do you want to play the video? Yes. So this is an example of how a screen reader reads content. And for those of you who don't know, a screen reader is technology that's typically used by individuals who are blind or have very low vision. We can get to it.
Introduction to Online Learning, CRN:1 Syllabus, DL101 Introduction to Online Learning, Course Information: Course Title: Introduction to Online Learning, CRN:1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Credits: 3, term: winter 2015. Instructor information: Hello, my name is John Smith, and I'm your instructor for this course. I've taught this course online for the past 2 years. Each time I teach it, I learn something new. Assignments/assessments: grading scale, grading scale by points, grading scale by percentages. Row 2, a B, B, C, C, D, D, F left parent or NP right parent, 202-225 plus 180-201, 157-179, 135-156, less 134, 90-100%. 80-89%.
So you get the idea. I'm hoping. So if you're a person who's blind, you're going to rely on the screen reader to access the course syllabus.
Assignments must be completed on time.
And if you'll put yourself in that person's shoes who's not able to see, when you're listening to this, yes, it sounds robotic, but if you're using a screen reader regularly, you can get used to that. Screen readers, some of them will also allow you to slow down the speed of the voice, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you can change the voice, sort of like with Siri on an iPhone. But if you're listening to this instead of looking at it as a visual person, the information is not as clear to you. So you may have to have another way of accessing this information. It might be something that's provided by our office, maybe an alternate format of the syllabus, so that it's very large font, perhaps. It might even need to be put into Braille, but those are things that our office can do. However, when you're thinking about your online materials, just consider whether or not a screen reader would be able to share the same information for, let's say, a person who's blind as a person who has vision. Something to consider.
So if you notice this table, the grading table on any syllabus, for us it's visual and it's simple. For a blind student, if you don't describe how the grading table is, that's all they hear. They hear A, B, C, D, E, and then they start hearing the numbers, but they cannot make sense of the numbers. So one way of making it accessible is to actually describe, which is, we currently work with a blind student, actually describe the table and say, table with 3 columns. First column says, and so there is a way to describe it on the side. Grade, underneath grade, categories A, B, C, D. Second column for category A, and it takes additional description, but it's just the way you would want to hear it if you were not able to see it. And so so making it accessible is both you describing the table and for us to go the extra step of brailing it. When we braille it, we can't really braille that. So we have to braille the description. I mean, we can, but we have to braille the description to the person who is blind so that they can get a sense of what first column says, second column says separately. So sometimes it takes additional steps, but it is doable. When the student reads it, it's beautiful. When the student tells you, I get it. I get how this table is done or how this picture is described to me.
Another option is to not use a table, but just to use a description. You know, for an A in this course, this is the requirement, and keep it very simple. When you start getting into graphics, that's when it becomes more of a challenge for the accessibility, especially online. Moving forward, and feel free, if you have questions as we're going, or you have examples or scenarios you want to share, please do. This is a resolution agreement from the Office of Civil Rights, some language that's pulled from it. And it was an agreement with South Carolina Technical College in 2013. And the reason I wanted to share this today is that this is the type of guidance that we utilize in our office to make sure that when we are advising faculty at the university of how to make their courses accessible, we're relying on what the Office of Civil Rights is sharing in their resolutions and their settlements, hopefully with other higher ed institutions. Although I will say that every institution is at risk and probably has, if they haven't already had, Office of Civil Rights complaints because courses are not accessible. We've at UTRGV, we've had a couple of situations where we've been able to work with students to make the courses accessible, but sadly there have been some complaints. So that's why this type of information is so important. Just to give you sort of the highlights of this first paragraph is very important because yes, it's about equal access, but something that's very important to consider is whether the student would have substantially equivalent ease of use. Just kind of thinking about that phrase, the student with a disability should not have to go to multiple extra steps to access information that the rest of the class who's not disabled would be able to access. So that substantially equivalent ease of use is very important beyond it being equally accessible. And I think the rest of that description goes on to share a little more detail of that.
And for the most part, we do work with professors when they're having a situation where a student, let's say a test, I think we just had this situation a couple of days ago. At an exam on Blackboard, professor said, in order for me to give extended time accommodations and all these other things, I would prefer for the student to take the exam with you in your office on paper. This is an online class. The professor said, I'm willing, I'll print it out, send it to you, and you just call the student and have the student go to your office to test. The intention is good from the professor. It is a good intention, but it's not equivalent ease of use because we would be adding barriers to the student. If this is an online course, we would be asking student, can you come to our office physically and take your exam? Even though the intention is good and the professor wants to make it accessible, wants to make the difficulty level of the questions equal for all students, it's presenting an added barrier to the learner, to the student with a disability. So that's what we mean with equivalent ease of use. So in order to receive accommodations, we don't want to really go into this deeply, but you do know that the student has to come to us and disclose, right? They have to say, we have a disability. They can't just go to you as professors and say, well, I have this disability, I'm having these difficulties, and can you work with me? So that would not be the appropriate way to go about it. So students must self-identify with us that they have a disability. If a student discloses that disability to you, then it is your responsibility as a member of the community to refer the student to us. So it's nice when professors want to work with the students, but it's best practice, and it's the legal way to go for the students to come to us, and we help them get those accommodations across the university community. Students with disabilities are not required to register for services, so we do have a big number of students who we don't know about, who are out there in the general, population of the university, going through their courses without disclosing, without saying, I need these things. And faculty should not provide accommodations unless they have been approved by SAS. When you receive as faculty an accommodation letter, a very thorough, extensive communication has happened with the student in order for us to say these would be your approved accommodations. Not everything the student requests as an accommodation is approved. We have to look into what are the limitations of this disability into the academic life of the student. So you should not provide the accommodations unless you receive that letter from us. And you do know that accommodations are not retroactive. So if the student receives an accommodation letter today and goes to you and says, but I've had this condition all along, can you reopen the exams or do this or do that? You do not have to, you're not obligated. Although a good communication and conversation between you and the student can really help the student to survive the semester, to be successful in the semester. But they are not retroactive. You do not have to go back and say, because you now have a letter, let me do all these things for you. You do not. Again, this is autonomy. This is the student's right to disclose and when to do it. Yes?
Is this a rule here, or is this like a federal law, or about the retroactive?
I see it on every university's website.
Yes.
And it's very common because it's really not fair to ask faculty to go back and apply accommodations. For example, if the student's already taken a test and they didn't do well, and then a month later they have the accommodations, the faculty's not required to go back and re-administer that test. That's really not a fair request. It is the student's responsibility, and the federal law is very clear about students in higher ed self-identifying. And from the point they self-identify with you and you refer them to us, and we follow our processes, that's when it becomes valid. And actually, we've taken it just another step forward to make it very clear that once the letter is sent from our office to the student and to the faculty who are listed in ASSIST, that's when the accommodations become valid. And that can happen at any point in the semester.
Now we're getting a second letter about attendance, right? Like how many absences are
Yes,
allowed?
we're going to be talking about attendance.
Okay.
Yes, because we realize that that can be a little different in an online environment. So thank you for bringing that up. We will talk about
Hybrid
it.
or flipped classroom,
Yes,
right?
mhm,
Because,
yes.
you know, I do lecture and then we do assessments in class, right? Labs. report,
Right.
And it's very hard to agree on a set of dates when the
Yes.
student doesn't know when they're going to be out. But, you know, so
Okay.
if there's like a blank where it says, okay, so you can be out, what, 10 days, 12 days? I mean.
It
5
depends.
times.
You're right about
It's
that.
very, you
Yes.
know, but you
Yes.
agree that it's very, hard to agree on a date.
And it can be very vague. And we can also participate in that process if you would like for us to. And that's for online courses as well. But we will be talking about that, and we know that that's a really critical concern. So moving forward so that we can get to the meat of those kinds of questions that you have. These are just some considerations. Online learner is the variability. There is no norm for the typical student, as you know. There's wide variation. And then as you prepare for that learner variability, we're going to touch on universal design for learning today that really allows instructors to focus kind of on that deep dive of learning too. And then of course we're going to talk again about equitable access because we have a diverse student population, and then the need for flexibility in your course design. That's really what we're talking about today. So we want to talk about some of the accommodations in detail. Attendance, as you mentioned, we knew that that would be a concern. So what he's referring to is the attendance accommodation agreement. It's something that we have implemented from our office in the last year or so. What we were finding with a very vague accommodation of flexibility of attendance, some of you may have seen that if you've been here for a little while, was that that was even more vague than what we wanted. And it's too vague for the students. It really provided no parameters. So we developed the attendance accommodation agreement after consulting with other universities to see how they were addressing it as well. It does require the student to meet with you. Can be a little difficult if you have online courses and that's the only interaction you have with the students, especially if your students are at a distance. So let's say they live out of state or they live 4 hours away and they're not coming to this campus, we know that's a real possibility. As with our office, sometimes what we have to end up doing is resorting to a Skype communication with a student or email. I really don't prefer email because it gets very tedious, but sometimes a phone call can do it if there's no other way. I prefer face-to-face, but we realize that that can be a barrier for our students as well. So it's really going to depend on also if your class is synchronous or asynchronous as far as the attendance accommodation and what would be reasonable. So for students in an asynchronous class, that really has a lot to do with whether or not they're able to manage their time, prepare, plan. It's sort of those executive functioning types of activities that the individual has to go through to make sure that they're turning in their assignments on time and Blackboard and that sort of thing. It's a little different when you have the hybrid courses or you have a synchronous class. So that's where it gets a little tricky, as you mentioned. It's really going to depend on the nature of your course and what you as the faculty member would deem to be an appropriate amount of absences that is beyond what's listed in the syllabus. So for example, if you say you can miss 3 times in the semester, you have 3 absences, I will be checking your participation. It's, you check in each week. If you're not participating, that could be counted as an absence. For an online course with that much flexibility, maybe 1 or 2 extra days would be reasonable, not 10 more days. The student may say, well, I really can't be online when you're asking me to be online. Well, then that's when it becomes an issue of referring that student back to us, because if the student's not able to participate in the class as expected, other than a few absences, then that's an issue for us to discuss with that student. Some students may not be able to complete a semester depending on the scenarios. For example, we have students who maybe are going through dialysis and they have to go to dialysis 2 or 3 times a week. If you know anyone who's been through dialysis, that also means that sometimes the following 24 hours even, or 48 hours, they're really kind of out of sorts. They're not able to really function clearly. So it really depends on the specific nature of the student's disability, but that's the conversation that we can have with them. But if you find that you're having the conversation with a student and you're not able to reach a mutual agreement, we can facilitate that conversation as well.
The other point the other point to touch on the number of absences would be how would you be making of this? So that's the next step of the conversation. If you are out more than my syllabus states 3 times and you are requesting additional 5 times, or that's the agreement, how are you going to make up for those missed assignments? And that conversation really needs to happen. Otherwise, it leaves the student thinking, well, I can just make it up anytime. And it has to be your call, not the student's convenience. This is not about convenience. This is a necessity for the student. But there has to be a commitment from the student. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Can you comment on pregnancy, especially as you approach delivery dates?
Yes. So,
This is an area that's new to our office, I'll be honest.
Territory.
We have recently received this responsibility. So we are in the process of learning how to address accommodations for pregnancy. I would say at this point, until we have policies and procedures in place, because there's really been nothing clear at the university previously, just contact our office and we can talk on those case by case. That's how we're gonna have to approach them right now.
so
I'm glad somebody else could get involved. I had a case where a student actually faked the medical records from her doctor in order to get an extension or something, and it was a nightmare.
We take great integrity and concern about student documentation. Not only is it confidential, but many, many times we tell students that what we've received is not enough. Sometimes if we have a suspicion about it maybe not being legitimate, we will contact the doctor's office. So we do take those steps to make sure, because we realize that accommodations should not be, and they're not intended to be, some sort of advantage. It really is for the purpose of removing barriers so that that student with disability has equal access. It will be the same thing for students, though, who are pregnant, or even if they have complications. So we have dealt with students in the past who have complicated pregnancies or high-risk pregnancies. So that part we're very familiar with. It's those that aren't high-risk that we're gonna start taking on as of now. Yeah. But we can discuss those case by case.
Okay, so if a student at the beginning of the semester contacted me and said, my due date is toward the end, I'm concerned. I told her it's probably not not gonna be a problem, you can do online, you can do the assignments well ahead. Am I supposed to tell her to contact your office?
You can.
Now you can. We have because before, and let me just give
Hot
you a
off the
couple of
presses.
Now you can. Before, the way it was handled, and it's still handled in collaboration, the student could contact the Student Rights and Responsibilities Office, that office, and so that office would work with the student in contacting the professors and saying, we know ahead of time the student will be delivering the baby towards the end of the semester, please work with the student so that student turns in all assignments before. And most students are willing, if the pregnancy is not a high risk, they're willing, they say, I'll just move faster, I'll turn in everything before I go to have my baby. And that's ideal, that's the ideal situation, that they work with you and that you work with them. But now we have that responsibility, so we really would like to be informed of who's pregnant in your classroom, so that we work with them, especially with medical documentation, make sure that accommodations would be appropriate, and that we have that conversation with the student and with the professor to try to resolve the situation before the semester comes to an end or before the accelerated course. The student has had in the past the option of, well, not the option, but the professor and the student have had the option of discussing an incomplete and putting everything on hold. We did it last semester. I think there was a student who took an incomplete and then came back and finished up after the baby. So again, it depends on the case, but we would like to know about those cases so that we work with you and we produce a document to support the student and you as well. Yes.
So this kind of ties into that because we get a lot of them that come through our program. And we work with Tanya a lot, and so we have cohorts. So we know our students, we have 2.5 years, and so we get a lot of pregnant students in our program that we document and we work out a plan and have a letter, we put in their file and all that. So something like that, I mean, still, if you want us to contact you,
I would say
work out a plan and how
to be on the safe side, yes, and it
Yes.
may just be that we're informed because we will start creating a separate type of accommodation letter for students who are pregnant. So, and I'm saying this very carefully because we are in the process of developing it ourselves. But moving forward, just communicate with us and we can move forward together. Yeah.
And, okay. And so it's the student that has to contact you, not us?
If you're aware that they have that request and that need, maybe to miss class or whatever it is that they're asking for, refer them to us, but maybe the best way to do this, and this would be for all accommodations, send an email to the student and copy us. That way we can engage just with a response to maybe set up an appointment or whatever it needs to happen. That's a really good way to do it. It's also a good way to track that communication that you're having with the student. You have evidence that you've referred them to us.
Okay, and we know then no more student rights, I mean, we've never done student rights responsibility, but no longer us.
Yeah.
And so, and it'll be a good idea to email the student and say, I'm copying Student Accessibility
Right.
Services. And again, let me go back to, it is the student's choice to request accommodations.
Yes.
They might say, I don't want anything, or I don't need accommodations. And if that's the case, then professor is free and has full right to say, you never requested accommodations, we offered it to you, or at least we referred you and you declined.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to student responsibility.
And does it help you if we've already talked to the student and we've outlined our plan of what we want to do to just to
I believe that would help us.
kind of copy that, to kind of copy that to you, and that way
That
you
would be
just have it on
great.
file then and
That would be great.
save you stuff. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes.
You-
No, that's
No, no, no.
okay.
Good
We didn't have
questions.
that on the list, but it's obviously a need, and we realize that. But we're in the process of establishing those procedures ourselves. Testing is another, I guess, common request that comes up for students, either online or in hybrid courses where they have an accommodation for extended time. I think the bottom line here, the most important thing I can say is that it's non-negotiable. And I know that sounds a little harsh, but at the same time, if it's something that our department has gone through the great lengths that we take in working with the students to determine what's appropriate for them because of their disability, if it's on the accommodation letter, just please know that we've taken great steps to get to that point. I just really can't emphasize that enough. So if they have extended time, you're in an online environment, if you're not sure how to extend the time for a particular test, you can contact Colt. They're really great at assisting with that sort of support. If you have questions about the length of time that the student has, that would be a question for our office though. Typically, we will start with time and a half, and you've seen that more than likely if you've seen accommodation letters. For some students though, because of their needs, we may have to go to double time, sometimes triple time, which is very rare, and in extremely rare situations, quadruple time. Generally, what we're looking at there is a person who has such limitations that the time that they need for a test is much more extended. Perhaps it's a person online with a physical mobility as well as a person who's blind, right? Maybe multiple disabilities. But those are the things that our department will look at to determine what's appropriate for that student. Paper-based testing, I think you had kind of touched on that, Layla.
If the class, yes, if basically if the class is online, and you're providing the students the option of a paper-based testing, then it's okay for all the students, but not just for one student. Not just to say you Tanya, take the exam on paper, go to SAS to take it. Also, let me just take you back, testing windows. We recently had a student who said, I would like for the student to extend my testing window, like for a couple of days. The professor opens the exam window for 12 hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And the student has an extended time for exams, accommodation. But the student might be misunderstanding that extended time is just for him to take the exam once he opens it, but not extended time for the professor to extend the window. So those conversations sometimes need to happen because the students misunderstand. They go on a Blackboard and they want to open it at 10 p.m. and the exam is no longer there, and then they call us, my accommodation was not honored. So we always have those conversations with students, no, your accommodation is for the actual time that you're testing, not for the window. If the student needs the window to be extended for some other reason, then the student is probably not disability related, but the student can talk to you about that as well. And also, let's see, extending the testing time for a student with a disability, it is the student's accommodation. Please do not extend the time for the whole class, and let the student know, because you have extended time, I have extended it to everyone. Everyone now has time and a half, because then that would not be an accommodation anymore. If that is the case and you extend it to time and a half for the whole class, then the student would need time and a half of that time and a half. So just don't extend it for everyone.
I've had faculty who, what they do, and, they're trying to be helpful, but
Yes.
they've actually just removed the time limit. How does that factor in?
That's a very good question. And kind of going back to what Layla was saying, there are plenty of OCRK settlements that say providing extended time to the whole class does not equal an accommodation for extended time. So, as Layla
They
said, the
remove
extension
it.
has to be in extension of what the rest of the class gets. But if you remove it, I just recently saw some conversation about this on the Higher Ed Disability Listserv, and there hasn't been an OCR case specifically related to it, but best practices would say don't remove a time limit. Because really, if you have a student and you start the test, let's say Monday morning 8 a.m., technically, if there's no time limit, they have until the end of the semester to complete it. That's really not good practice, right? So I don't think that's a good practice for most students. Lots of issues can happen with that. So best practice, I would say stay away from unlimited time on tests. Extended time on assignments is another accommodation that kind of goes along with the attendance accommodation. It's something else that we've tried to shore up and make our students more responsible. So they do need to approach their faculty members, and it may be through email if you're strictly online, to discuss in some way the limit that is allowed for them for that extension. Most of the time, and it even says it in the accommodation letter, typically you're looking at a 1 to 3 day extension. That is really just a rule of thumb. It is going to depend on your assignment, the type of assignment, is it a group project, or is it an accelerated program? All of those factor into what would be reasonable for extended time on assignments, much like it would be for the attendance accommodation. It depends on the essential requirements of the course. hope that answers that. Does anybody have any questions about extended time on assignments? That is one that we get a lot of questions about. Okay.
Individualized accommodation, if a student requests an accommodation not to be visible on camera. So your class is online, fully online. Sometimes you meet with the students on the class time through Skype or through some other means, and the student has an accommodation not to be visible, or the student requests, I just don't want to be seen, I don't want to present in front of everyone, even if it's on video. You need to have a conversation with the student, and we need to have it as well, on why. Is it disability related? Is it because of the disability that the student does not wish to be seen? And you might not know, it could be an anxiety problem, it could be extreme stress, it could be a physical impairment, it could be many things. So it's always good to talk to the student about why is it that you can't be physically present or on video when we're having class. Lecture notes, in advance of class, some students do have this accommodation. For the most part, nowadays professors upload their PowerPoints, their lecture notes, or some sort of outline to Blackboard so that students have access to it prior to class. When the student has this accommodation and the professor does not provide PowerPoints or lecture notes or something, then we typically contact you and say the student needs to access these notes prior to class so that they can be ready for class. And it could be different disabilities, but one of them, TBI, traumatic brain injury, they need time to process notes or note taking. It takes additional time to take the notes, so if we have an outline, they can be, I guess, more readily available to participate in class at the same time that the other students participate. And it wouldn't take an extra toll on them to write everything the professor is doing or saying. And sign language interpreter for distance learners, using a sign language interpreter or card can be a challenge. So we would really need to have conversations prior to the need for this accommodation or at the beginning of the semester so that we can ensure the student has an interpreter. We had one case, I think, a student is in Austin working on a PhD with some online courses and is deaf. So the student uses as an accommodation card, and the student calls at the beginning of the semester, I need card, I'm a PhD student, I live in Austin, and I also need an interpreter for the times I go out to do my practicum hours in the community. And so coordinating those services can take time. So we would want to know as soon as the student discloses to you, as soon as the student tells us, we start the communication with you telling you this is how we're going to do it for this student who needs these services.
I'm going to go back to something Layla had mentioned, the note-taking for a classroom environment. Oftentimes you'll have a volunteer note-taker as an accommodation. It's quite relevant for that type of environment. And that reminded me that sometimes faculty will call and say, but this doesn't really apply to an online class because it's either the discussion board or there may be audio recordings or videos. And so when you have an accommodation letter from a student, it doesn't necessarily mean that every accommodation that's listed will apply to your specific course. So that's why it is important for students to communicate with you about the accommodations. If you have any doubt, communicate with the student. It could be through a quick email. Let me know which accommodations you want to use for this course. If you get nothing back, then you get nothing back. You can also copy us if you ever feel like you need to include us on those communications, though.
So barriers to online accessibility. Barriers can be many. It can be informational or communication related. Print that is too small to read for some students with visual impairments. Audio that is difficult to hear. We have students taking classes. The professor is in Edinburgh, and we have a hard of hearing student who takes classes here. And they meet at the student union, one of the classrooms, and they meet through video with the professor. The professor's in Edinburgh, they're observing on video. But the student is hard of hearing, so we have had to work with the professor to ask him, would you be willing to use Integrity so the student can access these lessons after? Would you speak a little bit louder? So this is the student is here, the professor is in Edinburgh, so we have some communication barriers sometimes. Attitudinal, assuming that a person who has a speech impairment cannot understand you, or if I knew what the disability was, I could better understand how to help the student. The student is not obligated to disclose what disability they have to you. They can say, I have a disability, but they don't have to say which one. And sometimes we hear it from professors. If you tell me what the diagnosis is, maybe I should be able to help better. But this is attitudes. Another attitude, if the professor is using social media for class, for something in class, and it's a kind gesture from the professor. Let's say a student is blind, and the professor says, oh, she doesn't have to do this. It's okay. It's social media anyway. But if you are asking the class to do it, and then you're telling the student, don't worry about it, it's fine. I know it's hard for you, you can see this. It is a nice gesture from you, but it's not equal access for the student. So just, making sure that we observe what kind of attitudes we communicate to the students. And technological, an online syllabus that is not formatted for screen reading, that would be a barrier. And not recording lectures on integrity also, when the student can benefit from integrity.
Okay, good. We've had this first challenge before, and we've worked with Colt very closely. And I just have to say I'm very fortunate to have collaboration at the university, because that's really what I find is that's how we're successful. That's how we help our students be successful. So when technology does conflict in online platforms, what do? We go to the drawing board. We get the people involved together, and we figure out how to resolve the issues. So for example, a few years ago, we had a student who was using a screen reader and was not able to access the course material because it wasn't accessible. Again, good intentions. The publisher has all over the website, because we had to investigate this, right, that all of the course materials, all the textbooks are accessible. They were not. They were not. That's just the bottom line. So what we had to do, along with working with Colt to resolve some of those issues online, was that we had to hire a grad student to recreate the text so that a screen reader could read it. It was very cumbersome. It was time consuming, but that's what happens when materials are not accessible. The university is responsible for making them accessible. So that's just sort of a word of warning. If materials say they're accessible, they may or may not be. And that's a challenge. There's a lot of discussion in higher ed disability offices about how to make the vendors more, I guess, responsible for the material that they're putting out. And until universities stop making those types of purchases, there's not much responsibility on their part, or until there's lawsuits, right? So it's unfortunate we have to go that route. And it's usually the students who are filing the complaints, and OCR and the Department of Justice get involved, and that's where the lawsuits come in. We never want to be in that situation. It's very time consuming for everybody involved. So when in doubt, reach out, and if we don't have the answer, we'll find somebody that does. As we talked about, technology can be critical, especially for certain disabilities. We've talked about CART a little bit. That's sort of the live captioning, if you're not familiar with CART. Caption videos are very important in the online environment. And I know Colt is really great about making sure that you have access to captioning for your videos. If it's a student that's in a classroom or hybrid, if it's classroom, our office would be responsible for making sure that those videos are captioned. However, I'd like to ask that if you have the option and you can find the videos already captioned, sometimes that is an option, that's the best way to go, because that will allow the student to get the materials as quickly as everybody else. If you know that videos have to be captioned, your advance notice to our office or Colt is very important. Sign language interpreters, like Layla had mentioned, sometimes we might even have to have them live streamed if that's a factor. They need to be present in the online synchronous classroom. And then we've talked a little bit about screen readers, magnifiers, things like that that the student would use. Those are sometimes considered personal devices, but that's something that our office will work with the student to make sure that they have access to.
Best practice, again, is to review the Students with Disabilities syllabus statement during the first day of class. So make sure that students do know that if they have a disability, they can contact us. So that will be best, to stress it to students. Sometimes they're not ready to do it at the beginning of the semester, but they'll eventually come to us and do it. So we just want to touch base really quick on some specific disabilities and how it looks like for online learning. We do know that the number of students with autism is increasing in higher education. So every semester we see more and more students with autism accessing higher ed. If you know a student with autism or someone with autism, you do know that they might enjoy talking about what they like only, and this could be a strength for any class because they tend to become experts, quote unquote, on a field that they like. They might have an impressive vocabulary and excellent rote memory, but they might not be able to connect their vocabulary and their memory to some critical thinking skills. They tend to be visual learners, so if you're teaching online, videos, graphs, visual supports can be super critical for them. And they may prefer online learning just because of the nature of their disability. They don't want to be interacting with others. Online learning is perfect for them. But they do have challenges. They may have difficulty comprehending. They may give you the impression that they are understanding, but they're really not. And social and group activities can be a challenge for them. And also they have a very short tolerance to frustration, and they have difficulties with excessive functioning. We do have a student with autism right now that we had to speak to the professor about increasing the time for testing because he gets very frustrated. He tests with us individually, but we had to increase the testing time. And an accommodation that simple reduces the frustration level for the student. This is online, again.
And of course, this is if the student reveals what their disability is. But we do know that sometimes faculty will have certain questions about students with autism, students who are blind or visually impaired, as we've talked about previously. And I know we're running out of time. And then the other category that we hear a lot from faculty on are students with mental health conditions. Really in each, I would say the mental health and the autism, you have the executive functioning difficulties. So the planning, the time management, the organizational skills, sometimes those really become huge challenges for those students. So that's what we have to consider when we're looking at the accommodations, but it's just also something for you to be aware of with different populations of students. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
With Blackboard Collaborate, and you guys may not know this, the folks may, when you record a Blackboard Collaborate session, does it automatically, once it gets transferred into video, does it have a closed captioning?
No. With Blackboard Collaborate, you would need a live transcriber, somebody to be accommodated by SAS to sit in during that session, to be assigned as the transcriber. So there is no live feed going on, and there's no Google Translate or what have you that's going to bring automatic captioning in. So that has to be done physically while the session's going on synchronously. After the fact, though, if the session is fully online or offered hybrid, that same recording is then saved as an MP4, and then that might be able to be captioned after the fact. So,
Did they update the feature where you can assign someone as a captioner?
yes.
Yes, he's always been able to.
So you can have a captioner capability, but you would have to ask someone to be some caption.
It's a good question.
So we will make the presentation available to you before, so that you know, we will make it. We're not get to cover everything, it's expensive.
I know with the time and a half, like sometimes as a student, need time and a half an assessment.
Right.
And then I ask the student, how's it going, and oh no, I don't need time and a half.
Okay.
So how do you respond
That
to
is
that?
a great question, and I think that's a very common faculty question.
Because
And
then I
we've
feel
even-
like, okay, well, do I take it away?
Right, and so the quick answer to that is no, because there's lots of OCR cases too about faculty cannot make it, I forget the word, but like an independent decision about removing an accommodation.
Okay.
It has to happen in conjunction with our office and the student. And universities have disability offices designated to be the decision makers when it comes to accommodations. But we absolutely want to have that collaboration with faculty so that we can understand what's required. So that's the short answer. But as far as, it's going to depend on the course. Maybe a student needs extended time on, let's just say essay exams, but with multiple choices, they can process the information a little faster, and that's pretty common for most students, right? So maybe the student doesn't need it in your class, if you have mostly multiple choice tests. So it's going to depend on the type of test as well. We also know that lots of students have flare-ups. That's probably the best way to describe it, in a particular type of condition. Perhaps it's a mental health condition. It could be a physical medical condition. Let's just say the student has a seizure disorder. So sometimes during the semester, medications and everything are working well. They've had a few seizures, but you never know. Middle of the semester, end of the semester, they could have a change in their symptomology. And so at that point, that's when we prepared for that student to have that extended time. So that's why you may not always see that they're using it, but sometimes it's there because we know that there's the potential that they'll need it. That's probably another way to describe that.
I'm sorry, I know there's two different, one is an evaluations, if you have the little box, that is for a cold conference, and please let us know if you do not have the second one,
Thank
which
you.
is for SAS.
The cold one, you can just, when you walk out the door, leave it on the table, we'll pick them up.
And the SAS.
Yes, we would like to take it.
Yeah,
Part of our
SAS,
office's goals and objectives.
You can hand it to someone in an orange shirt and we'll give it to Leila and Tanya. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for SAS?
You know where to reach us.
Here in Brownsville, Cortez 129. I'm here, Tanya's in Edinburgh, but we do communicate with each other every day, every time.
Every day,
Well,
every
let's
time.
everybody give a round of applause for Tanya and.
Thank you.
Please know the discussion does not have to stop here. Don't forget, we have a knowledge bar. We are advertising Blackboard Ally, where please come by and see how that can be used, so that way you can take the necessary steps to move forward to make accessibility important in your class. Thank you.